morning, I want to take another step in our journey. We're in this series called Mark My Words. And all we're doing in this series is we're taking a look at the book of Mark, a book in the Bible, and the words of Jesus, kind of diving in once in a while, right? Pulling out some of these words of Jesus and saying, okay, what did he mean by that? And so we've looked at some words already that Jesus spoke, words that literally branded people's lives forever, changed the whole trajectory of their life. Some other words that we've looked at Jesus are words that have echoed across generations, words that have literally impacted the entire globe. If we were honest, we've looked at some words that are perplexing at times. Some of the words of Jesus we've looked at are hard to swallow. Some of the words of Jesus make you scratch your head and say, did he really say that? Some of the words of Jesus are polarizing. And then some of the words of Jesus, when you read the Scriptures, are downright shocking. We looked at some of those words last week, some very shocking words of Jesus. And here's what we've said. We want to look at these words of Jesus in a way that not only do we mark these words, but that these words have a chance to mark us. I mean, that's the point, right? The point is, if Jesus said it, we want these words to somehow mark our lives. Now, here's where we're going to go this morning. Last week we looked at some shocking words of Jesus. I believe the words we're going to look at this morning are no less shocking. You might not think at first, well, they're very shocking, but I can tell you this, whether you think they're shocking or not, they at least are polarizing. By polarizing, I mean they divide people, and they're very polarizing, and there's something that in our culture is very relevant. Very shocking words. The problem is that we've made these words ceremonial, and they've lost their shock. This morning, I want to look at what Jesus has to say about marriage and divorce. I want to take a look at what he has to say, and the reason that I know these words are going to be unsettling to some degree, that they're going to be hard to some degree for some of us, they're going to be a little uncomfortable, and all of that kind of stuff is because to their original hearers they were that way. When Jesus first shared these words in the account in the book of Matthew, his disciples had a response to what he had to say about divorce and marriage. And here's what his disciples said. We'll throw it on the screen. His disciples said, if this is the case, it's just better not to get married. So we know what we're going to look at today is going to be like, wow, that's what his disciples said after he shared what we're going to look at today. So here's what I know. I want to talk to you before we dive in. For some of you in this room, I know that what we're going to talk about is going to be hard. It's going to dig up wounds. For some of you, it's going to be uncomfortable. For some of you, you're going to be like, man, where's he going? I feel kind of gross about this and all that kind of stuff. Here's all I'm asking. All I'm asking this morning is that you stay with me. That you stay with me to the end. In fact, I'm asking that you not leave early today. I'm asking that we're going to finish this service with a song Pastor Mark's going to sing. We're not going to do it together. He's going to sing. And I'm asking that you not even leave then. That you stay and allow what I want to share with you to settle in, debrief, think through. But I'm asking you to stay to the end, or you're going to miss the heart and the spirit of what's going on here. Because Jesus has some very fascinating things to say about marriage and divorce. Now, here's what I know. I know they're very relevant because we live in a culture where there is a debate raging over marriage, right? I mean, it is a very hot debate in our culture. There are some in our culture that stand in the camp of, hey, we need to get back to traditional values, right? We need to go back to the way it was when my grandma and grandpa got married. That's the way marriage ought to be. And so there's people that are in that camp like, man, that's the way marriage ought to be. When there's other people like, can't you see that culture is kind of evolving? I mean, it's a little different now than it was then. And so we need to take marriage, adapt it to culture. So we need to redefine marriage so that it better fits the culture that we're in. And then there's people in between. They're saying, hey, you're both crazy. I think marriage is an outdated institution. I think we'd have scrapped the whole thing. It's just not working very well. Wherever you're at in that camp, and I don't know, I bet there's all kinds of people in all kinds of places today. Here's what I know. Jesus has some things to say. The last 4 weekends, I've done 3 weddings and 1 vow renewal in the last 4 weekends. It's been a busy month. And in these 3 weddings, 1 vow renewal that I did, I always, almost in every ceremony, say the same thing at some point during the ceremony. And what I say are words right out of Jesus' mouth. Here's how those words go. They're in Mark 10, verse 9. He said this, therefore, what God has joined together, let man not separate. Now, listen, I believe personally, and I'm going to tell you why in a minute, I believe those are shocking words of Jesus. The problem is, many of you are like, hey, man, I've heard those tons of times, been to tons of weddings. Man, a lot of people say them, and you're like, doesn't seem all that shocking to me. I've heard it over and over again. And the reason it's not shocking to us is that we've made ceremonial what is shocking. But these words of Jesus are a bit shocking, particularly in our culture, because they run right against the grain of our culture. And we won't understand how shocking their impact is unless we color in what happened around them. So I want you to take your Bibles and I want you to turn to Mark chapter 10. I want you to go there with me. We need to do the hard work and look at some things that Jesus had to say about marriage and about divorce. Now, as you're turning there, I'm going to talk to different segments of you, and I'm going to come back and talk to you at the end of the gathering. Okay? First of all, those of you who are teenagers, young adults, and you're single, and you're like, oh great, talking about marriage today. I can't think of a more relevant message than what I want to share with you. We have some very important things. If I could have my children for a half hour sit down, this is something I'd want them to hear. None of whom are married. I'd want them to hear this. Very relevant. There are some of you in the room, you're married, and you're kind of coasting along, and I want to say this, that what we have to say today, I hope challenges you. I hope it maybe rattles you a little bit. I hope maybe it causes you to renew your vow. And there's some of you that are really struggling. You're really, really struggling in your marriage. And so to you, and there's all across the board, to you, here's my hope. My hope is there's some things that can provide some challenge, some healing for you. I hope that if you have children that are living in your home and maybe they haven't seen the picture of a good marriage, that they would look at the words of Jesus and then they would see you pursue what Jesus has to say. There's some of you in the room this morning, you're divorced. And you're like, okay, where's he going to go with this? I need you to hang with me. I need you to hang with me through this, okay? Because we're going to go some places and we need to see what Jesus has to say. Because I think he has some things to say about marriage and divorce. Let's read it, make some observations. Beginning in verse 1, chapter 10. Jesus then left that place and went into the region of Judea and across the Jordan. Again, crowds of people came to him, and as was his custom, he taught them. Verse 2, some Pharisees. You're saying, well, who in the world are they? Some of you are like, what's a Pharisee? Pharisee was a really religious guy. Really religious guy, dotted all his I's, crossed all his T's. Okay? He was somebody who did everything right, so to speak. Okay? And so they came and tested Jesus. Now, I would add the word again. It was kind of their hobby. They kind of like to test Jesus. But this particular time, here's how they want to test him. They want to corner him. They want to trick him. And they say, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? Stop, look up here a second. I want the Bible to come alive to you. Okay? So you read that like, wow, that seems like an interesting question. But here's what I want you to know is these guys made it their hobby to trick Jesus, to corner Jesus. They want to get him in trouble so they could discredit him. Right? But what they're asking him in this particular occasion is particularly tricky. You say, why, Dan? Here's why. If you just go back a couple chapters, Mark chapter 6, Jesus had a cousin. His name was, anybody know? John the Baptist. And John the Baptist lost his head over his answer to this question. You see what I'm saying? See, Herod, John the Baptist called out Herod for how he was living, and Herod didn't like what John the Baptist had to say about this particular issue. So all of a sudden, we got a question that's not like, hey, here's trivia. They're like asking Jesus something pretty important. Not only that, but what Mark doesn't do, that Matthew, in his account of the very same circumstance, does for us, is fill in that Jesus is being asked, I need you to work hard with me here, or the rest of today is not going to make sense. He's answering a very specific question. In Matthew, here's how the question is asked. Matthew 19:3. Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? Mark has that much. Here's the key. For any and every reason. You're saying, Dan, what's the point? Here's the point. In Jesus' day, there was two schools of rabbis. What's a rabbi? They taught the Bible. They were the teachers. There was one school called the Shammai school. You can forget that. They were really conservative. Traditionalists. Right? And so they read the law and they're like, man, you only divorce for this and that. And, we read it this way. And so they were traditionalists. But then there was this other school, the school of rabbis called the Hillel school. And they read the Old Testament, a particular passage in the Old Testament that talks about divorce a little different. You're saying, what do they read different? Well, here's how the Old Testament rolls out. In Deuteronomy 24, Moses, it says, permitted God's people to write out a certificate of divorce. And the reason that a man could divorce his wife in the Hebrew was literally the reason you could divorce your wife was for a thing of nakedness. I'm like, what? Well, if you translate that, what does that mean like to us? How does that translate into English? Literally, how that would be translated is this, is that it was okay or it was possible to divorce your wife for a cause of immorality. So this group, stay with me on this, they read that, and in the Hebrew, which is what the Old Testament is written in, Moses used two words, and it confused them. They're like, why would Moses use two words? Why wouldn't he just say divorce is permissible for immorality, use one word? But Moses used two words. He used cause of immorality. And so they began to scratch their head and said, what Moses must have meant was this, that it's allowable to divorce your wife for sexual immorality or any cause. And so therefore they started the any cause clause for divorce. And the way this rolled out was this. Guys were literally divorcing their wives for burning the toast. Guys would divorce their wives if their wives developed wrinkles as they got older. You see how crazy it got? What these guys are coming and asking Jesus is a very specific question. Don't miss that in this. They're saying, hey, is it lawful for us to divorce our wives for any and every cause? And then here's what Jesus says. Look at your Bibles. He says, what did Moses command you? Well, they said he permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce. Very important. They always tried to pit Jesus against Moses. Right? They always tried to do that. It would discredit him. And what Jesus says is, what did he say? And so they go back to this Deuteronomy 24 passage that these two camps of rabbis disagreed on. And then Jesus said some fascinating words that I want you to get a hold of this morning. Verse 5. Look what he says. He says, it was because your hearts were hard that Moses wrote you this law. But at the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man will leave his father and his mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, here's our statement, let man not separate. Let's not stop, though. Verse 10. When they were in the house again, that's the disciples, they asked Jesus about this, and he answered, anyone who divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another man, she commits adultery. Now, just stop a second. It's okay to be like, wow. I mean, some of you right now, I know what you're like, did Jesus really say that? I mean, that's like tough stuff in our culture, right? I mean, is it that? What is he saying? Here's what I want you to know, and we're going to cover both today. Jesus has some things, and we got to start here. He has some things to say about marriage. If we don't get this, we're not going to get the rest of it. You've got to hear what he says about marriage, or the rest of it doesn't make sense. Jesus has some specific things to say about marriage that lead to and build the foundation for what he has to say about divorce. What does he have to say about marriage? I want you to write this down. Jesus says that marriage, first and foremost, is designed and defined by God. It's designed and defined by God. Do you see it in there? He says, but at the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. What he's trying to help them understand is that literally marriage is God's idea. He invented it, came up with it, has its roots in the very creation of man. This is important because we live in a day and age where everybody wants to mess with the definition and the design of marriage. Right? I mean, we just do. We live in a day and age where here's how it rolls out. You know, our culture's changed. We have this institution of marriage. So here's what we need to do. Let's adapt marriage to how our culture is. What Jesus foundationally sets up in this passage, no. Go back to the design and the designer. You see what I'm saying? Big difference. We live in a day and age that say, no, let's make it fit how things are rolling today. In fact, I read an article. It's fascinating. I don't know that I would have believed it had I not read it. But it's a very serious article about a guy who definitely wants to do this. Listen close to what he says. He's a lawyer. He says, we all know that far too many marriages end in divorce. Yet this institution of marriage refuses to adapt. So why is there no effort to improve the legal structure of marriage when it shows itself to be deficient? He goes on to say marriage is a legal partnership that lasts a lifetime, one lifetime to be exact. Generally speaking, he says, that's a long time for any partnership. People change, circumstances change, all sorts of things change. The compatibility of any two people over decades may decline with these changes to the point of extinction. No wonder marriage doesn't work, he says. In real estate, one may own, listen close, a life estate in a piece of property. This is comparable to the term of marriage we use, a lifetime commitment. But he says also in real estate, one may hold possession of property for shorter terms through a lease. Here's my suggestion, he says. Why don't we borrow from real estate and create a marital lease? So instead of wedlock, we would have wed lease. Fascinating, isn't it? And what he says is, if the relationship is bad, the couple then could separate their ways at the end of the term of the lease, and the messiness of divorce is avoided, and the end can be as simple as vacating a rental unit. Fascinating, isn't it? You see, we live in a culture that's like, okay, it's not working. How can we adapt marriage? And what Jesus is saying, no, you're missing the point. Marriage is God's idea. And because it's God's idea, it's the foundational relationship that he started in the garden. Do you ever think about that? The first relationship that everything's built off of is the relationship between a husband and a wife. It's not a parent and a child. It's not a friend and a friend. It's a husband and a wife. But because God is the designer, he's the one who defined it, and he is the one who regulates it. You see, Jesus is saying, you've got to go clear back to the beginning, and here's what you need to know. If you want to understand how this whole marriage thing works, then submit to the designer and the design. Now, he says something else. Verse 7. He says, look at this. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife. Two key phrases there. He says, he will leave and be united. Old terminology, a lot of you have heard. He will leave and he will cleave. Right? Old terminology. That word that he uses there is literally the word cleave, to be united, is the word glued together. It's a covenant term. Okay? It represents something that's binding. It's an oath. It's a promise. That's what he's saying. What's Jesus saying about marriage? Here's what he's saying. I want you to write this down. Jesus says that marriage is a promise of future love. It is not a declaration of our present feelings. Guys, this is key. Teenagers, you may not be married, and you may not have anybody you're dating, and you may not be looking to get married for a decade. But if ever I want you to hone in on something, I'm going to say, this is it. This is it. Because what Jesus is saying is that marriage, God's design for marriage, is that it's a covenant. It's a promise of future love. What he's saying, if I'm going to submit to God's design and definition, when a couple, Jordan and Luke, up here exchanging their vows, when they were exchanging their vows with each other, what they weren't doing is simply expressing their sappy feelings for each other right then. I've yet to marry a couple that isn't feeling all warm and frittery inside for each other, right? What they were doing is they were making a promise to each other into an unpredictable future. It's important. That's what it means to cleave. That's what a covenant is. They were promising to each other, you can be sure I am going to love you into a future I don't know much about. And when they did that, they were saying four things. Get your pencils ready. I want you to get these things. No blanks for it, just write them down. One thing they were saying to each other is this: I love you enough that I will close off all the other options. I love you enough that I will close off all the other options. You're saying, Dan, what are you saying? I'm saying that a covenant, as it rolls out in the Bible, marriage, is saying, I want to make this covenant to you and I will love you exclusively. I will keep myself for you and for you alone. It is to my wife that I'll cleave and have a one flesh relationship. I will pursue that and protect that. Here's the way I said it. I've said it this way up here before, but some of you haven't been here that long. When I stood in front of God and witnesses and shared my vows with my wife, here's what I did. Here's how I want you to remember it. I looked at her and I said to Jennifer, I do. That's what I said verbally, but that wasn't all I was saying. When I said to Jennifer, I do, I was also saying, and I won't. You follow me? I'm saying I do. I am going to exclusively save myself, be faithful to you, and I was saying I won't. That's the point. You see, and it's an exclusive kind of say, I'll close off all other options. Not only that, I want you to write this down. When you stand and exchange those vows, you're saying, you are my new priority. You're my new priority. This is where I want married couples to kind of dial in with me a little bit. Jesus says, for this reason, a man, before he cleaves to his wife, he'll leave his father and mother. It's important. It's important. Why is this important? Because in their culture, the king relationship was the relationship between parent and child, right? It's where a child got his significance, his identity, his income, all that kind of stuff. Key relationship. What Jesus wants them to get would have been absolutely radical to them is, I want you to leave that priority relationship. Now this relationship is the priority. There is a shift in priority. That's what he's saying. When you exchange those vows, you're saying, I love you, and now you are my new priority. You see, where it shakes down in our culture, we're thinking, well, man, parent-child relationship maybe isn't as king as it was in their culture. But that's not the point. The point is this. I think Jesus is teaching you'll never cleave to your wife, your husband, in the way he's talking about here until you leave the other relationships that are taking priority. Whether that's your golf buddies, your old boyfriend, the gals you hang out with and get all your time. Here's what he's saying. There's a new priority. That's what he's saying. Fascinating, right? See, that's the covenant. That's the covenant. He says, I want you to leave what was a priority. Now this is the new priority. And then he's saying this, or I want you to write this down. He's saying that when we exchange our vows, we're saying to each other, I will keep my appointment to be with you in the unpredictable future. We're literally saying, I'll show up. I'll show up even though I have no idea what the future is going to bring. When we exchange vows with each other, here's what we're saying. You can pencil me in. Now think about it. Pencil me in whether things are good or bad. Pencil me in whether we're rich or whether we're poor. Pencil me in whether you're healthy or whether you're sick. Guys, I want to tell you something. We have some beautiful, beautiful, beautiful examples of that in our church. I go to visit a guy in the nursing home who he and his wife have been married over 50 years. She comes to the first gathering here. And for the last better part of a year, she's been showing up to the nursing home every day. Every day. She spends probably 6-7 hours there every day with her husband who can't remember what happened yesterday. And here's what I can guarantee you. Here's what I know. She had no idea when she stood there 50-some years ago and said, I do. She had no idea that's what she was saying, I do. And this is what's going to happen. Unpredictable future. But what she was saying is that I promise, whatever it is, I'm going to show up. Guys, here's why this is important. Track with me for a minute. I want you to hear me. Married, struggling, not struggling, unmarried, married, doesn't matter where you're at. Listen to what I'm going to say. It's the power of the promise that will bring strength to your marriage and promote security in your relationship that gives any prayer for true intimacy to be understood and felt. I got to say that again. You need to hear this. It's the power of the promise that I make that gives strength and resilience to the marriage, causes me not to run out too soon, that promotes security. I don't have to work hard to impress you so that you'll stay around. It's the power of the promise, promotes security, that then opens up for me to be real and naked with you. Literally. Emotionally, physically, whatever you want to call it. And it's the power of the promise that looks a lot like the gospel. You're saying, what? Think about it. Jesus, the one who came and died for us, that when we place our faith and trust in Him, says this, hey, when you embrace me in faith, I will never what? Leave you nor forsake you. I don't got to work to impress God and hope He doesn't reject me. It's the power of the promise. I live from the verdict of who I am in Christ. I don't live hoping that He'll accept me and that I'll be around tomorrow and He'll be okay with me. That's not how I live. That's not how it rolls. You see, in your marriage, in our marriages, it's the power of the promise that gives security, gives strength, and opens up the possibility for true intimacy to be understood. Last but not least, I think that when we exchange those vows, this is what we're saying. I'm committed to who God is making you. I am committed to who God is making you. I want to make a statement that probably will make you scratch your head, and it's okay if it does, it ought to. Okay? Who you're married to now is not who you will be married to. Yeah, some of you are like, huh? I didn't think we were allowed to do that, right? I'm going to say it again. Who you're married to now is not who you will be married to later. Think about it. I promise you, who Jennifer married back November 4th, 1989, is not the same guy she's married to now. Physically, emotionally, mentally, experientially, spiritually. See, I know this, we all change. We all change. In fact, if you're a follower of Jesus, here's what I know. Christ is constantly wanting to what? Transform you. And so when I exchange the vow, it's not like, hey, I'm committed to who you are. Hope things don't change. I'm saying I'm committed to who God is making you to be. And I'm so committed to who God is making you to be that I'm committed to Him making me who He wants me to be so that I can encourage and be a part of who He's making you to be. That's fascinating, isn't it? You see, when I made the vow with Jennifer, I was not simply saying, I'll love you, protect you, cherish you, while you become more like Jesus. But I was saying, I'll do all those things as I become more like Christ, and I'll allow Him to transform me. Now here, last thing about this particular point, and then I need to roll. I want you to see this quote by a guy named Lewis Smees. Here's what he says. He says, if forgiving is the only remedy for the pain of our past, then promising is the only remedy for the unpredictable future. Think about this. I know it's a little bit of a deep statement, but what's the remedy for all the crap and the hurts and the stuff in my past? I don't know anything else in Scripture other than forgiving that's the remedy for that. I don't. But if that's the remedy for the pain of my past, then what's the remedy and solution for this unpredictable, unknowable future? And what he's saying is it's only the power of the promise that's the solution and the remedy. It's fascinating. And that's exactly what the gospel demonstrates for us. And that's why marriage is a picture of the gospel. One other thing Jesus says about marriage, and then I need to get to the next section. Jesus says in this passage, I think it's in there, that marriage results in a unique friendship. He says, for this reason, a man will leave his father and his mother and be united to his wife. And what does he say? The two will become one flesh. So they're no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together. Here's the point. I need to fly through this, but here's the point. When God created, He said over and over again, it is good, it is good, it is good, it is good. And then He said, it is not good. You remember that? When did He say it's not good? When He saw that old boy alone in the garden, didn't He? He said, this ain't good, this old boy's alone. I need to create Eve. And so He created Eve. And what happened, you can read it, this is what Jesus is pointing back to. He brought them together and created and formed a unique friendship. I'm going to say it specifically. Teenagers will track with me. A unique friendship with exclusive benefits. You know why I'm using that phrase, right? Because the phrase friends with benefits, pretty common phrase. What God says is marriage is this unique relationship in a covenant where those exclusive benefits of which physical intimacy is a part are to be kept and expressed. I created it that way. He says, therefore, what God has joined together, I want you to know this about marriage. Marriage is first and foremost a spiritual event. More than a legal transaction, a business arrangement, a social status, it is a spiritual event. It says God literally yokes together two, and God makes them one. Marriage isn't the process of becoming one. God makes them one. This is going to be important for later, so I'll say it again. God makes them one. Now, let me take a little rabbit trail. Single adults, teenagers, I want you to look up here a second. I just want to talk to you because we've talked a lot about marriage, but I think this has something to say to you. Doesn't Jesus' heart on marriage have something to say to you about how you choose a spouse? I think it does. Think about it. How do we in our culture choose spouses? We all have done it. We walk into a room full of 10 people, opposite gender, and we start to draw conclusions, right? And a lot of times we draw conclusions and we can eliminate 8 right away. Why? Well, she's too tall. She kind of looks funny. She's fat. She's too skinny. Right? Hang with me. That's the way we do it. And so we make decisions on whether or not we're going to go any further based on chemistry and this spark, and did I feel it, and did it. So that's how we make decisions, right? So we go in, we eliminate 8 right away, and sometimes eliminate some that are perfectly wonderful candidates for the covenant relationship. But what happens is we make decisions and then we pursue because, man, there's a spark, a little pizzazz, right? And so we start off with pizzazz. And then what happens is over time we hit some things in marriage, things begin to change in marriage, and all of a sudden the pizzazz starts to fade, and there's absolutely nothing else there. You see, I think what Jesus is saying is this: hey, marriage is a unique friendship out of which comes emotional and physical intimacy. It flows out of this unique covenant relationship, and it is expressed in physical intimacy. And I think it has plenty to say about how we choose a spouse. And I would say to you young adults and you teenagers in the room, if you're making a choice totally based on sexiness and romance and physical appearance, I say be careful. Be careful. I think you're missing the heart of what Jesus has to say about marriage. Now, Jesus has some things to say about marriage, but he also has some things to say about divorce. And I know some of you are like, oh boy, here we go, right? And I want you to hang with me to the very end. You've got to stay with me. I want you to hear everything I'm saying. I want you to write down some stuff because he has some things to say and we cannot skirt it. First thing is this. Jesus says that divorce is the result of sin. Jesus says that divorce is the result of sin. Verse 5, you see what he says? It was because your hearts were what? Hard. That Moses wrote you this law. Here's the point. I don't need to camp on this very long. When I marry 2 people together, here's what I'm doing. I'm marrying 2 sinners together. I usually tell them that in the ceremony, right? They're like, thanks for that, right? I'm always marrying 2 sinners together. I know that every last one of us are flawed. We have sin, and here's what happens. Sin creeps in and plays havoc on our marriages. So whether that sin is the most horrific betrayal of the marriage vows that you can think of, or whether it's simply irreconcilable differences that are driven by my self-centered nature, wherever it falls in there, it's good to recognize that 2 sinners come together in marriage, and sin is usually at some point, whoever's more at fault, that's another conversation. Sin usually is playing a part in divorce, which leads to what Jesus has to say in verse 9. Look at it. Jesus says, therefore, here's what I want you to know. Don't adapt marriage to your culture. I want you to go back to the designer. Therefore, what God has joined together, let man not separate. What's Jesus saying? Well, I think a guy named Andy Stanley says it better than I could ever say it, so I just quoted him. I think Jesus is saying that divorce is trying to unone what God has made one. Stay with me on this, guys. The Pharisees were looking for what our culture is looking for. They were looking for a loophole, right? Here's what they were saying. Hey, Jesus, when is divorce permissible? Right? Give me the checklist. I think that's what they were doing. And I think Jesus turns the question. I think what Jesus is saying, wrong question. It's not when is divorce permissible. It's more like, is it possible? Because I think what Jesus is trying to say to them, he's trying to say, man can't unone what God's made one. He's saying a judge, a piece of paper, a legal system can't unone what God has made one. That's why he says these shocking words. He says, therefore, if a man who divorces his wife and marries another woman, he commits adultery. Why is he saying that? Like, Jesus, I don't think you get how the process works. He's saying because man can't unone what God's made one. And so you think that this made it unone, but only God can unone what was made one, and marriage is about God making it one. You following me? And so that's why he says, man, so you thought a piece of paper, a judge said that, and so you went over here and did this, and you don't understand divorce and you don't understand marriage, because marriage is a spiritual event first, and it's God joining 2 people together, one. Which leads to something I think Jesus says here that helps us make sense. And I really need you to dial in with me right now. Some of you are feeling a little like, I kind of like to dial out, Dan. I need you to dial in now. Because I think God, He's saying, you can't unone what God's made one. Don't minimize it. Don't rationalize it. Don't try to adapt it. God makes two one. But then Jesus says, when God makes them one, don't miss this. He says He makes them one what? Flesh. And that's where a guy named Tim Keller says something, I just quoted him on here, that I think helps us understand divorce. And here's how I want you to write it. Jesus says that divorce should be more like an amputation than a prescription. You see, here's what I know. If you went to a doctor who every time you went to that doctor, his first impulse was to do the extreme. So let's say you went to that doctor and said, hey, doc, my hand hurts. And doc said, cut it off. Right? Hey, doc, my ankle hurts. Okay, cut it off. I got a runny nose. Okay, cut it off. You think, you crazy? Like amputation for every problem? You wouldn't go to that doctor, would you? I mean, here's what you know about amputation. Amputation hurts. Amputation is very hard. And amputation is the last what? Resort. Guys, get this. I think that's what Jesus wants us to see here. That God makes us one. Therefore, we are one flesh. Divorce is like cutting off what has become part of me through marriage. And just like amputation, it hurts. Some of you know that firsthand. And just like amputation, it should be a very, very hard decision. And just like amputation, this is where our culture kind of goes right against our culture. It's not an easy prescription for every irreconcilable difference. But it's a last resort. But here's where I really need you to hear me. It's hard. It hurts. It ought to be a last resort. But sometimes it's necessary to live. Sometimes the only prescription the doctor can give is amputation, or else the patient's going to die. Sometimes gangrene and infection becomes part of this body of mine, and the doctor's like, gotta cut the leg off, man. Isn't there another alternative? We've tried every alternative. Gotta cut the leg off. That's the only way for you to live. And I think Jesus wants us to see that divorce is a big deal. Don't minimize it. It's not an easy prescription. It's a last resort. It hurts like heck, and it ought to be a very hard decision. But sometimes, Jesus says it's allowable. Sometimes it's allowable because it's necessary to live. In fact, I want you to write it down. Jesus says that divorce is allowable sometimes. Sometimes it's allowable for life. There are instances where divorce, although it's hurtful, is allowable. Jesus, in this account in Matthew 19, gives us one of those. You can write these down. These are just, I think, Jesus giving us His heart on this. He says, I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except sexual immorality and marries another woman commits adultery. Let me tell you what that word means there. That word sexual immorality is the word porneia. Can you see what word we get? Sexual immorality, pornography. That's where we get that word pornography, fornication. I think Jesus is answering their specific question. Remember, can we divorce for any reason and sexual immorality? Jesus is answering their question like, you guys have kind of made a funny little statement out of that. You're missing the point. I think what he wants us to know is that sometimes sexual immorality, pornography, all those things get in there and they create a gangrene. There's this marital unfaithfulness that takes place, and it becomes so infectious that for me to live, see what I'm saying? I don't think Jesus is giving a checklist, though. You see, some people read this and like, was it a checklist? Whoop, I qualify. I don't think that's what he's doing, because I think you find elsewhere in Scripture there's some places that talk about this. Paul talks about it. 1 Corinthians 7:15, this is what he says. He says, if the unbeliever leaves, let him do so. A believing man or woman is not bound in such circumstances. God's called us to live in peace. What's he saying? It seems like that when a believer and an unbeliever are married together and the unbeliever takes off and says, I'm out of here, I'm not doing this thing, let him go. Let her go. The believer is not bound in that situation. There's this other obscure passage that many people overlook. I think it's interesting because it shares the heart of God in Exodus 21. And I think it points to the fact that when neglect is a part, here's what it says. But if the slave owner arranges for a slave woman to marry his son, that's the way they've done it in her culture, he may no longer treat her as a slave but as a daughter. If a man who has married a slave wife takes another wife for himself, look at this, he must not neglect the rights of the first wife to what? Food, clothing, and sexual intimacy. If he fails in any of these three obligations, these three things that happen in the covenant of marriage, she may leave as a free woman without making any payment. Now here's where I really need you to stay with me because I'm almost done. And don't look at the clock because I've already killed it. If you read this as Jesus giving some sort of checklist, well, here's the checklist for being able to get divorced, you've missed the point. You've missed the heart of Jesus. I don't think that's what Jesus is doing. Otherwise, why wouldn't Jesus have said, here's all the reasons that you can get a divorce? I think what Jesus wants his hearers to hear is like, marriage is a big deal. And divorce is an amputation. It's not a prescription. Should never be entered into as a first impulse. It's hard, it's hurtful, but sometimes it's necessary. And in those times when it's necessary, here's some instances, it's still hard and it's hurtful. But I think Jesus would want us to know this, that even though divorce is allowable sometimes, I want you to write this in, it's not required. That even though it may be allowable for me to get a divorce doesn't mean I have to go get a divorce. Just because somebody has an affair doesn't mean I have to amputate. Because I would tell you this, that sometimes it's in those very situations when the power of the gospel has the most opportunity to shine the brightest. And I can point you to illustration after illustration of couples who have walked through the trail of their marriage covenant, decided we are going to allow the power of God to work in us to bring us to reconciliation, and the power of the gospel has exploded. Jesus has some things to say about marriage and divorce. And I know that some of what he says is hard. I know it's unsettling. That's why I would love to talk to you now in groups. I'm going to ask the worship team to come out and get set up at a risk, because I know I might lose you. I'd love for you to stay connected with me. Because I've thought all week about how in the world do I end? How in the world do I talk to you? And so I want to talk to you in groups. Teenagers. Single, young adults. Can I talk to you for a minute? You might be sitting here saying, holy smokes. I think it just might be better not to get married, you know? And you'd be right along with the disciples. And you want to know something? You want to know something? Like, I'm okay that you feel that way right now. Like, I think it's okay that this has kind of got you a little off edge and that you think maybe it's just better not to get married, because I would rather you stop and think and be deliberate before you run into the second most important decision of your entire life. And my challenge to you would be this, that if this is God's design, my challenge would be, what if you submit it to the designer? And what if all of a sudden how you chose a spouse had more to do with what he said marriage was about than simply about your passing, fleeting sexual attraction? Let me talk to some of you in the room that are married. I don't know how this hit you, but maybe the way to walk away from this, you can't leave this passage without knowing Jesus is saying, hey, God has a design. And maybe the application for you this morning is simply to go home, grab your husband's hand, grab your wife's hand, and renew that vow. You don't need a big ceremony to do that. Just renew that vow that you made to them however many years ago. Because you want to know why? You want to know why? Because there's some of you sitting here right now that right now, that's the very thing you need to lean into. Because it's hard. You don't feel like it. It's hard. And the only thing you have to provide strength and security in your relationship right now is the promise of that vow that I'm going to be there. There's others of you that are married, and maybe the way Jesus' words hit you is like, you know something, she hasn't been the priority. If I'm just being honest, like my golfing buddies, my hunting buddies, they've been the priority. And maybe the way this hits you is like, I want to somehow demonstrate the gospel, and I want my wife to know she's it. She's my priority. There's some of you sitting here. I've talked to some of you. I know. You're contemplating divorce. You may be thinking to yourself, shoot, should have went ahead and did it. It's easier to ask forgiveness than permission. Now I've got to deal with this, right? So now you're kind of stuck. You're like, now what do I do? And I'm okay with that. I'm okay with you somehow maybe being a little uncomfortable with the decision you were getting ready to race into. I'm okay if somehow this slows the process down for you. And I would beg you, don't listen to me. Don't get divorced because it's hard. Don't run into it just because you're not happy right now or because they're not who you thought they would be. Chances are you're not who they thought you'd be either. And I would beg of you to slow down and recognize what Jesus has to say about marriage. But I say all that, and I realize some of you are in gangrene situations. I understand that. And my heart goes out to you. I've talked to some of you in my office. You've cried tears in my office. You didn't want to. You didn't want to be in this situation. But the only way for you to live, there was an amputation. And it hurts like heck. Because now you're raising the kids alone. Because what you once had, you don't have right now, and you're feeling it. Some of you have already been divorced, and I want you to know this. I am so glad that you're here. And I want to tell you that here at Grace Church, we want to walk through that particular hurt with you. We have a group called Divorce Care. Why in the world do we have divorce care? Because divorce hurts like heck. And it's hard. And it's lonely. And we want to provide a community of people for you to be around who will walk through what you're walking through. Some of you are sitting here and I got to imagine you're thinking, well, okay, I'm divorced and I'm already remarried. Like, am I living in perpetual sin, Dan? Like, am I just in this constant state of sin? I really don't think so. I don't think so. That's my opinion as I read this. I think what Jesus is saying, hey, it's the act of. And some of you are like, I didn't know any of this, and then I came to Christ, and I've been divorced like 3 times, and I came to Christ, and here's what I know. The Bible says you're a new creation in Christ. That's cool. You're a new creation in Christ. Some of you, though, you knew all of this. If you were just being honest with me, you're like, I knew all that, Dan. I did what I wanted to do anyways. Now what do I do? My eggs are kind of scrambled now. And I would say to you what I'd say to anybody who did what they knew God's heart didn't desire. I'd say call it what God calls it. Quit trying to minimize it, rationalize it, and justify it. Call it what He calls it. Confess it. May lead to an interesting question. Okay, Dan, I'm married to this woman now. Am I supposed to leave my second wife and go back? Some of you hope I say yes, you know. I'm not going to give you an excuse to do that. Here's what Paul said. He said, whatever situation you're in, when you learn this truth, stay in that situation. My advice to you would be this. That in that marriage, you would pursue all God desires for your marriage. Every ounce of what He design and plan for your marriage. I know this. There are some of you in there that are like, this feels a little gross, Dan. Did Jesus really say this? I feel a little condemned. I feel a little condemned, and I want you to slow down. And I want you to remember that the same guy who spoke these words is the same one who knelt down and he looked at that naked woman caught in adultery in the eyes once all of her accusers had left. And he said, I don't condemn you. Go and sin no more. And then a few chapters later, you know what he did? He died on the cross for her. See, Jesus, the story and the power of Jesus is the power of healing. It's the power of grace. See, I don't know where you're at in that spectrum, but I know this. These words somehow mark each of us. Doesn't matter who you are, where you're at in that spectrum. And so, Father, as we listen to this last song, I pray that you just quiet our hearts and help us to hear whatever it is you want to say to us this morning.